Coming up on today's episode, we talk about the shocking revelation that the abolition of Section 21 could be delayed for social housing, but not for the private rented sector, the unintended consequences of the Renters' Rights Bill, and the never-ending court backlog, with our special guest, evictions expert and founder of Possession Friend, Chris Daniel. Thank you so much for coming on today, Chris. It's really great to have you on and to get your expertise, particularly around eviction, as that's something that we hear a lot about on our site. We get a lot of questions coming in from readers talking about it, so it's really good to have your advice on this. If we could just firstly start with your organisation that you run, Possession Friend, that helps landlords deal with eviction and give advice. So could you just briefly tell us, how did Possession Friend first start? How did it all come about?
Okay, Gabriella. So, in a previous life, I was initially an advisor, a telephone advisor, and then a trainer for a landlord association. And so landlords became aware of me and started approaching me with problems and evictions. Not always with evictions of bad tenants. Some were problems with a local authority, problems with a deposit dispute, counterclaim, all kinds of issues, but certainly a lot of it was around possession. And so I started, contracting directly with landlords to give them that assistance, and set up my trading website as Possession Friend. Quite a lot of good reviews on there. And one of the things I do is I offer free advice to landlords. So if they've got a couple of questions, they want pointing in the right direction. They might not necessarily have a piece of work that they want me to do, but I'm happy to arrange, a telephone conversation with them to point them in the right direction. So that's something that I offer.
Oh, that's really great, Chris. Thank you so much for that offer, because I know you comment a lot on the Property Lemonade website as well, helping with advice. So that's really, really good. And I suppose from your line of work as well, what are some of the common mistakes you find when a landlord's trying to regain possession? So, for example, when a landlord issues a Section 21 notice, what do sometimes landlords forget?
So common difficulties with Section 31, which is obviously it's only got limited lifespan left, but common difficulties will be compliance with a plethora of legislation, and government have been making it harder and harder for landlords to use Section 21 for a decade or more. They've not liked it, and until actually the abolition of it about to come shortly next year. So it's complying with all those prescribed pieces of information. You can do that retrospectively with virtually all of the prescribed information. There are question marks around gas, even some question marks around gas certificates that are still not legally resolved, despite the Crackabell House case that gave landlords some respite against the problems of gas certificates to use Section 21. So I would say record keeping and being aware of all the legislation, as well as having their ducks in order and crossing all the T's and dotting all the I's, then, to put it plainly.
Exactly. And as you said there, there's so much legislation that landlords have to follow. I don't think people realize how many pieces of legislation there are. Do you actually know how many pieces?
Yeah, well, yes, it was counted up to be in excess of 400 when I last heard a figure quoted some years ago. There's been more legislation since then, so I know it was north of 400 some years ago.
Wow, that's a lot. And that covers a lot as well, doesn't it?
Yes, you've got everything from fire regulations, furniture safety. It depends really how deep you want to go into it. And some landlords approach me where the local authority are doing an inspection and have picked up issues that they want to serve an improvement notice over, or civil penalties. You know, I had a landlord approach me with civil penalties, and it was the first time that particular local authority had used civil penalties, and they made a mistake, and I found that mistake, and so not only did they withdraw the just over £3,500 worth of civil penalty, but then I went after them for the landlord's costs. So everything the landlord paid me, we sued the local authority for, and which they denied, and they took it to within 14 days of a court-listed hearing, whereupon they decided to pay up in the interests of expediency.
Oh, wow. And that just goes to show as well that it's not, local authorities do make mistakes when it comes to this.
Yeah, it's thought that when officials like local authorities pick up landlords for making mistakes, that they can't make mistakes. Well, yeah, they can. And so if you've got somebody with expertise that can go through the legislation, and look for where they have made a mistake, then it's possible that whilst the landlord might have made mistakes, the way they've gone about it, or may not have according to the legislation, depends how deep you go into it and what you find. But it could be that they've made mistakes that mean that they're not able to pursue it. So
Mm.
it needs, if you've got, I guess the takeaway from that is if you've got something like with housing related from a solicitor, the local authority or whatever, speak to a specialist, as myself and others that will look into the legalities, specific legalities of it, and and tell you where you stand.
Exactly. And I think, as you were saying earlier, it just kind of goes to show the double standard sometimes, doesn't it? Because obviously, if a landlord does something wrong, there's a big fine and punishment. But when councils do it, it just tends to sort of be a slap on the wrist. And that's about it, really, isn't it?
There's a weekly web email government lawyer, local government lawyer, and in that, which I subscribe to so many things because obviously I got to keep myself on top of the game in the industry. But that's one of a huge number of things I read. I have to do background reading to keep myself right up there at the top of the game. You see in that numerous councils who have been found at tribunals or complaint processes to have breached their responsibilities in regard to housing. And then on the housing ombudsman circulars, which I read, numerous sort of social housing providers being dragged over the coals and being fined and reprimanded. So yeah, certainly, you tend to the publications about bad landlords in the press, or private landlord find property in a terrible state. You don't see so many of those appearing in the media when it's a council owned property, but there certainly are.
As you've literally just said that in your example there, that it definitely does happen. And if we could move on to the courts now, obviously we know there's a huge court backlog, which doesn't seem to be getting any better. And we've had Labour saying, oh, they're going to fix the courts. Whether they actually will or not, we don't know. But what steps can landlords take to avoid lengthy court delays? Or is it just a case of actually they've just got to sit and wait?
Well, to avoid getting into the court process really in the first place, has to be. But if that's unavoidable, you are within their waiting process, and yes, it is several months. And you're right, Gabrielle, it's only set to get worse because things are this bad at the moment when there is a more expedient process for possessions in the form of Section 21. When that goes, and yes, the last government did tried to put that caveat on the ending of Section 21 by saying, well, we need to look at how can the courts manage and what have you. But nothing has been put in place. This current government are not taking that as a factor or consideration. And it will be somewhat of a cliff edge, as one barrister I spoke to yesterday was describing it. Interestingly, that same barrister I spoke with about a month ago told me, and this is shocking and not well known, that the government have been mooting the idea or discussing the idea of delaying the abolition of Section 21 for social housing to allow them time to put processes in place, whereas they won't do it for private landlords. So there is this concession, if you like, being given to or being considered given to social housing at the moment, which won't be available to private landlords. So there's really a two-tier discriminatory treatment between housing providers here.
Wow, I didn't know that at all. So thank you for that
Not
exclusive.
many people do, and I only found out about it a month ago. I was at a barristers conference when it was raised. I'm actually trying. I spoke to the barrister actually yesterday who raised it a month ago, and I'm trying to find out where that was actually published. And if I do, I might write a short article for Property 118 on it.
Yes, please do, because as you said, I haven't heard about that. And as you said, it does show a double standard with the government that these social housing providers, they're obviously getting a delay in Section 21, whereas us private landlords, they're saying no, it has to happen straight away.
And it's certainly not because social housing providers are whiter than white, or perhaps that's not a politically correct way of putting it, but they're certainly not, you know, blameless when it comes to housing regulations or conditions.
Exactly, and as you were mentioning earlier, the housing ombudsman usually publishes a list, don't they, of social housing
Yeah.
providers that
Yeah.
with all the complaints.
Mm. Yeah, I
So
read that regularly, and it's full of them, and full of them being criticised for having numerous warnings and not having robust complaints processes, and quite shocking, really. Things that a private landlord would be a lot less a private landlord. We would be drawn over the coals in the media and criticised and called a rogue landlord for. But we know if the rogue landlord seems to be a term that's only referred to private landlords and not council landlords or social landlords.
exactly, and it is really, really shocking to hear what some of these social housing providers actually do. It's just so awful. If we could move on, obviously we've been talking about the abolition of Section 21 and the Renters' Rights Bill, which is just going to cause, I think, havoc to the private rented sector. It's the biggest piece of legislation in 30 years, and a lot of landlords are really worried about it. It's obviously going through Parliament at the moment, and there was a committee stage meeting. And I think it was Teresa Wallace. She said that the Renters' Rights Bill is going to have unintended consequences for the private rented sector. Do you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. Everyone agrees in the profession. The unintended consequences will be less properties for rent, higher rents, scarcity. And those two things go hand in hand with the scarcity. And the people who are going to feel it. A landlord's got one property to rent, and there was previously three, five, or 10 people chasing it. Well, you can only rent that property out once. Well, when all the government interference and the havoc is wreaked by removing Section 21 and landlords exiting from the market or being even more careful who they rent to, and maybe deciding to exit from LHA tenants because of the risks of not being able to get the property back through Section 21. And there is a lot of landlords who will take a gamble on tenants, give them a chance because they don't housing benefit. But the abolition of Section 21 is going to remove that. So it's no of detrimental effect to landlords because there's now 20 people chasing that one rental property. It's the extra 19 or extra nine extra tenants that are going to be at a loss from these interventions. It's really shooting tenants in the foot. Yeah, the statistics I always quote is that the English Housing Survey, and you can't get a bigger survey than that, certainly dwarfs that YouGov citizens advice joke. Um, they consistently, year after year, show that 85% or 84% of tenants are satisfied. Well, 99% of tenancies end upon a tenant's own volition. So that leaves at least 99 point something. So less than 1% of tenancies are ended by possession processes, whether that be Section 8 or Section 21. But a combined of both possession processes account for less than 1% of people moving from their home. Now, whatever legislation you bring in, there's always going to be a need to evict tenants for as long as properties are rented, that you're never going to be able to remove that. And so, it's really a sledgehammer to crack a nut. And the nuts that are going to be cracked are, in the main, tenants.
Exactly. And I think it's just really important to mention as well that a good landlord doesn't want to evict a good tenant, right? That, as you said, the English Housing Survey, most tenants are really satisfied in the private rented sector.
Yeah, there is always going to be a small number of bad landlords. Relatively, there's a small number of bad tenants, given the numbers, we just spoke about. And the government would have been better focusing on the problem area than using a shotgun approach that, that captures and tries to fix things that aren't broken.
Exactly, exactly. Now, we've been on, before we started the interview, we were talking a little bit about the housing coalition that Possession Friend is part of. So, could you just explain for Property 118 viewers that don't know what the housing coalition is? Could you just briefly give us a little explanation?
So it started off in a number of years ago, or 4 years ago, landlord groups got together and tried to form this to sort of push back at government around the COVID time and also when Section 31 was being mooted. It didn't get anywhere. I tried to revive it on more than one occasion a couple of years later and was unsuccessful. But I have been successful in reviving it. And it's started now somewhat over a year ago. So what it comprises of is regional landlord associations, most of them. Most of the regional landlord associations are members. Online forums like Property 118 and Property Tribes are members, and also some prestigious housing solicitors that some people might be familiar with. They are members, and we are, whilst it's heavily landlord focused at the moment, we want to try to widen that. We've had bailiffs, High Court enforcement officers who are members to give us their perspective, because they have problems with the criminal justice system as well as landlords. And so we had an inaugural meeting a year ago in Property Mark offices in London. Property Mark have kindly agreed to be the secretariat for the Housing Coalition. We have a steering group where about 5 of us meet three times a year. So what have we done then? Well, we're very young as a group. You remember probably about 3 or 4 months ago an article, it was in Property 118, about mold, a survey that Citizens Advice had done or commissioned YouGov to carry out. And I looked into that in detail. And basically, YouGov had been given 2,000 names of people who had complained to Citizens Advice about mold, and Citizens Advice had said to the 2,000, this is what best as I could find out. Citizens Advice had given 2,000 names of people who complained about mold to YouGov to ask them whether they had any mold. And surprisingly, a large number of them had. And so And so these statistics about incredible percentages of tenants suffering from mold was published by Citizens Advice. So when I tried to query it with YouGov, they quickly tried to absolve themselves of any contact and put me on to Citizens Advice to answer my questions about the statistical significance or failings of the survey. So what we have done, what the Housing Coalition have done, have written to Citizens Advice, and I introduced ourselves and said we are keen to learn more from them about what people, and we are genuinely, aside from the criticisms I've made about that survey, that we are generally concerned to learn more from Citizens Advice about what tenants are bringing to them in terms of complaints, and also what are they suggesting? What remedies are they suggesting? And so we've had an acknowledgement from Citizens Advice to say they've received our letter and that they are considering it. But that was a little while ago, so we'll probably need to chase that up. But we will continue in that vein. The things that are published that concern landlords that we think the Housing Coalition should have some input into, we will continue to explore that. So we're quite young at the moment, but we are pushing back.
That's really great to hear. And as you've been saying, you guys are obviously just starting out, but that's really, really good to hear that you are actually pushing back on some of these, particularly with the damp and mold topic, which again is a really big issue that we hear a lot about on Property Nominate. And hopefully, fingers crossed, Citizen Advice might actually come around the table and actually speak to the Housing Coalition.
Well, if they do, we'll publish a short write-up on it, and if they don't, we will send something into Property 118, which will be telling, but disappointingly so, if the result is that Citizens Advice don't want to engage with us. And also, because I think we have mentioned the mold survey, it will somewhat lend some further suspicion to the credibility of that survey, I'd suggest.
Yeah, because as you were saying, the percentage was quite small, about 2,000, was it?
2,000 people who would come to Citizens Advice. Well, people without mold aren't going to go to Citizens Advice. So, yeah.
Exactly. Well, fingers crossed. Hopefully, maybe if anyone from Citizens Advice is watching, then please do meet with the Housing Coalition. That'll be very good. Now, obviously, my last question. Obviously, we know the Labour government hasn't exactly got off to the best of starts with, well, everything in general, and also with the private rented sector. So, what do you and the Housing Coalition want to see from the Labour government to actually support the private rented sector?
Well, if I've got to be brutally honest with you, Gabriella, the Labour government don't support the private rented sector, quite the opposite. So I don't expect any concession from the Labour government, or really the previous Conservative government either, because they weren't Conservative entirely; they were more socialist Conservative. There was so little difference between the last two governments that they're hard to discern. So I think landlords have got to tighten their belts, weather the storm. One of the things that I've looked at recently that Section 21 was being used for is antisocial behaviour, and I'm doing some work with other specialists in the antisocial behaviour. I was actually on a whole day's conference with them yesterday on antisocial behaviour and looking at ways that landlords can sort of like tighten their belt and make themselves ready for and or use the legislation around antisocial behaviour if they need to progress onto a Section 8 claim. And so I'm looking at that. I'm looking at perhaps writing an article up on my website. I did one on disrepair, which seemed quite popular on what to expect if you do a rent arrears Section 8 claim and the tenant counterclaims for disrepair, because that's becoming increasingly popular because it's legally aided funded for the tenant. It takes about a year or 15 months, during which time a lot of the time they don't pay rent. The implications for the landlord are huge because they have to respond to the counterclaim. If they lose any of it, they incur significant solicitor's expenses for the tenant. So that article was popular. And I say I've represented landlords in rent arrears claims where there's been a disrepair counterclaim. It massively increases the work and the time and the expense. So it's not it's not a good position to be in, which is why a lot of landlords were using Section 21 because they didn't want to get into that position. But unfortunately, when it goes, we are going to have to engage in it.
Exactly. I think, as you said, landlords are just going to have to weather the storm, aren't they? It's going to be very, very difficult, I think. But I hope with the Housing Coalition that can help. Particularly, have you had any meetings at all with the government, or is that
No, we've not been
no?
officially recognised by the government yet. We're going to be knocking on their door, so to speak. Um, what I would say to landlords with the abolition of Section 21 is to give whatever hope I can give to them is a lot of landlords now, certainly me included, in the main have been looking to seek to rent to tenants that have only got an acceptable guarantor. Because if you have got somebody on the hook, that's a huge lever for dealing with a tenant and problems. And it's about getting your ducks in order. It's about making sure you are compliant. I know that's more of an issue with Section 3.1, but it will be used, no doubt, when we get into the Section 8. The court processes will be longer. That will mean, more potential rent arrears whilst the tenant is you get an eviction. So it's not good news. I'm not going to try and say that the abolition of Section 1 is good news. It's not. It's going to incur difficulties for landlords. But as I said, I'm my advice initially is free. I am looking at ways in terms of specifically ASB that I can try and find ways to help landlords if they have that kind of problem that leads to them wanting possession, because they wouldn't be Section 3.1. They have to go down the Section 8. So I'm looking at that. And the Housing Coalition will continue to monitor the position with possessions and other housing matters and discuss them as time goes on. So yeah.
I know a lot of landlords will be very, very grateful for the Housing Coalition and for your free advice as well, which is really, really grateful. And for any Property 118 viewers, we'll include a link to Chris's website below. And I know you comment a lot on the Property 118 website as well. So any landlords, please do get in touch with Chris because his expertise is amazing and I'm sure he'll be able to help. So thank you so much, Chris, for coming on today. We really, really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabrielle.